Are you nuts? That's what I said.
And they've all been writing historical fiction. Gary Sledge has co-written 2 books of historical fiction. And there are lots of writers in the audience, so I guess I always imagine when I'm talking to a crowd that I'm talking to someone very ignorant. It's kind of unsettling.
They know as much as we do.
That's more, probably more. And then we have Joe Wallace, who's just come out with a book called Diamond Ruby, which is a historical novel built around the true story of a girl who struck out Babe Ruth. And Warren Berger, who's just finished a book called Purples about a gang, chiefly known for stabbing people in the back. And Esmeralda, and I actually got to hear Esmeralda's book when she was just conceiving it, and called Conquistadora.
So every book is a little different. I looked at, looking through this, our second book, which is called The Map of Paradise, for an incident that illustrated this kind of nexus, where we put fictional characters with historical figures. And so in this one episode that I'm thinking about, we have King Kalakaua, the king of Hawaii, Robert Louis Stevenson, who was his guest on a yacht, and our 2 fictional characters, a would-be poet and his consort, his girlfriend, who is with him, who helps him write, and who in fact is the poet. And you found it one who just happened to have some kind of family connection in 1844. Did you run across the bear?
Well,
and all of a sudden your fiction seemed, it really was real? You've been psychic?
Well, I mean, probably 100 times, but just a little minor one. I mean, baseball is just one little part of this because she plays baseball. It's really a survival story about this girl.
You're a baseball expert.
Well, I am, but I also was perfectly prepared to. Well, I was more than prepared, though. But you know, what was wonderful about this was getting to write what I felt like was a very sort of human story, with baseball as only one of the sort of characters in it. But at one point, I needed to invent a baseball field in Brooklyn. And so I was researching, and at some point where I hadn't even gotten to the part of the book where I was going to have to place this field, and I didn't know where, I'm going along and reading the research, and I find that there is at the time that I'm setting the book, 1923, there was a derelict baseball field in Brooklyn that had been the field that the Dodgers had played at before they moved to Ebbets Field, and it was torn down in 1926, but it was still there in 1923. So I was like, thank you! Now I know where it is!
I'm mostly a memoir writer. I've written 3 memoirs, and so I've been looking back on my own life. But there came a point where I was wondering. I realized that my grandparents were the last connection I had to my past, because I didn't know. We were very poor people, so there was no record. And but I really was curious about how did my mother and father end up together. They have the same last name, but they come from completely opposite ends of the island. And so I began to just read about the history of Puerto Rico at the time when they were born and they lived. And the more I read about them, the more I kept going back and what about my great-grandparents? And how about my great-great-grandparents? And the more I wrote about them, these characters began to appear to me in my imagination. And my object was, I realized I didn't have ancestors. I didn't have any way of proving who they were. So I said, well, I'm just going to invent my ancestors. So I'm just
commonly done.
In real life as well as
nobody can look it up. But I was very curious about how did I become a Puerto Rican. I came to the United States when I was 13, and I've been here longer than I lived there. I was in school until 7th grade, so I was just beginning to learn about the history of Puerto Rico. So I really didn't have a sense of Puerto Rico, but I was very, very curious about those people that that made me that I couldn't get to. One of the things that I discovered in the process of this, of just reading about Puerto Rico before I invented the characters, was that, you know, there was very little information about people like us, because they, you know, all three of my four grandparents were illiterate. So this is where I come from. These are, you know, my dad is very dark, obviously from slaves. You know, my mother's very fair from part of Puerto Rico, where a lot of people come from the Basque country. So I kind of began to research those kinds of things, and these characters began to appear to me as if they were really my ancestors, and I loved them.
Totally. Which is so different now than it was in the 1920s. I mean, it was, in the 1920s, Detroit was like the center of the universe. I mean, everything was happening there. It was, you know, the auto industry, skyscrapers going up, you know, a speakeasy on every corner. It was like the liveliest, amazing city around. And you go there now, of course, and I did. I made, you know, a number of trips there for the book, and of course, you know, it's like a ghost town now. But the interesting thing to me was that I still felt like I was getting a feel for the city, even though it had completely changed. There were things I got out of walking those streets, going to the banks of the Detroit River. There was a certain feeling I got out of that was really valuable in doing the book. Even if it had completely changed, there was something that was the same. And, you know, it ended up being really important.
Esmeralda, I came out of not writing nonfiction, and therefore I've always been a very, very tough critic of a lot of historical fiction, because with some frequency it overlaps stuff I've researched, especially if it's set in New York, since a lot of the research I've done, I did a couple of weeks at the American Museum of Natural History. I knew enough. I didn't know a lot. I wasn't an expert on the subject, but I knew enough to know when they were fudging it, when they were getting something not wrong because you have the right to do things, but wrong. Like, they didn't have to be wrong. It didn't benefit the book by being wrong.